Hi, I'm Amy. I'm the Exhibitions and Interpretation Officer at Elmbridge Museum, and you're watching our Ask the Expert interview with a historian, which is part of our latest exhibition, A Day at the Races. So in this exhibition, we're looking at the history of Elmbridge's two famous racecourses, Sandown and the now closed Hurst Park. So today I'm talking to horse racing historian Stewart Nash. Stewart has previously given lectures at Molesey Local History Society and is author of Plumpton, an illustrated history of Plumpton Racecourse, 1884 to 2000. He's based in and around Elmbridge. Thank you so much for letting us interview you, and I'm sure that you'll shed so much more light on this huge aspect of Elmbridge's history. To start with, could I ask you to please maybe outline how horse racing began and became popular? And among which classes it was popular when it began?
Yes, of course. Horse racing in one form or another dates back centuries, and the Rudy at Chester is probably one of the oldest still in existence, and racing started there in 1540. There were literally hundreds of race meetings in the 17th and 18th century, mostly once a year affairs which coincided with local fairs and holidays. And provided all types of sideshows and entertainment. In Surrey, there were race meetings at Croydon, Egham, Guildford and Reigate. There was also meetings at Croydon and Streatham, which of course are no longer in Surrey, but were in those days. And there was also a very short-lived period of having meetings at Oaklands Park between 1827 and 1831.
Thank you very much. That's really interesting, actually, because I think in the collection that we have an early race card for Oaklands Park, which will be going on display obviously once lockdown is over. So yeah, it's really interesting, and it was quite an early one as well. Just moving on to the formation of Elmbridge's two most famous racecourses, Hurst Park and Sandown. So in its early days, pre-1890, Hurst Park was known as the Hampton Races. Why were they situated where they were, given that Molesey and Hampton were small in terms of their populations?
Before the days of the railway, people didn't travel far and sought entertainment locally. So even small places had race meetings. Although Hampton was rural, there may not have been suitable land on that side of the river available for race meetings. And so the Hurst, which was just across the river, and the ferry went across the river across from Hampton Church, was the ideal place for a racecourse. Hampton races took place there from 1814 to 1887. The contemporary accounts claim that thousands attended.
That's really interesting. Do you think that the proximity of the Thames then played a part in its location, because river travel was so prominent back then?
Yes, it would have been a way of getting to the races. Obviously, the early meetings at Hurst Park or on the Hurst predate the railway coming to the area.
Okay. And I've read that a lot of courses closed at the start of the 20th century, and I wondered why that was, because the Jockey Club made various changes. What kind of changes were being made that caused so many courses to close?
Well, basically, the Jockey Club was formed in 1750, and that was the start of trying to put some sort of structure around racing and also some sort of regulation. Over a period of time, they started then to look at the safety standards and the conditions of courses, and also look at the types of races and prize money. And so gradually they had a setup that only horses that had run at what were their authorised meetings by the Jockey Club could run at other authorised meetings by the Jockey Club. And gradually they did start to withdraw the licenses from some of the courses, and in fact by the 1800s, 1880s I should say, Hampton races, the state of the course, it was an open common, so everyone could wander across it as they wanted to on non-race days, was in a very poor state, and the Jockey Club withdrew the license. So the last meeting there was held in 1887.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's interesting that at the same time as many courses are closing, Hurst Park is just beginning and thriving. How did the Hampton races kind of become the Hurst Park races?
Well, it wasn't a smooth transition, because Hampton ended, as I say, in 1887, and Hurst Park didn't open until 1890, and it was under completely different management. But what had happened was that in 1875, Sandown Park had opened, and Sandown Park was the brainchild of Lieutenant Colonel Owen Williams, who bought the land, which was part of Sandown Farm when it became available. And his brother, Hoofer Williams, recognised the site as being excellent for a racecourse because of its natural landscape. And so recognising some of the problems that surrounded horse racing, because one has to say that with the old open racecourses, racing did attract its fair share of thieves, rogues and vagabonds and undesirables. So the concept that Hooper Williams introduced was to put a fence around the course so that admission would be charged to all parts of the racecourse, which had the effect, A, of bringing in more revenue, which is one of the reasons Hampton was in such a bad state, because they had very little income. And it also enabled them to only let in or to eject people who caused a problem in one way or another.
Great, thank you. That's really interesting, actually, because I do remember saying to you about when we had a very early phone call about Runnymede having a similar problem with the Egham races being based there, and I think that was part of the reason that the Egham races were shut down, was the problem with you policing thieving and criminal activity there. Was the perimeter fence around Sandown, was it particularly necessary at this course because the problem was much worse than other areas, or I'm just wondering why there in particular had a perimeter whereas others didn't?
Well, I think Sandown was the first one to have the concept of having a fence, and therefore it was something totally new. Up until then, Epsom, which is, as you know, the home of the Derby, is an excellent example of what an old race course would have been, because you can still go to Epsom and go on the centre of the Downs and watch the racing without paying. There is no perimeter fence. You have to pay to go into the grandstands, and that's the change that was made, really. And once Sandown had their fence, it became such a huge success, making the whole day at the races concept much more friendly and suitable for all that attended, that the thing caught on, and a little bit like the development of the railways in the 19th century, everybody then wanted to think about having a closed racecourse, and they were followed quite quickly by Kempton, Lingfield, and Hurst Park.
Okay, right, that's interesting. I didn't know that they implemented that at Hurst Park afterwards. Did it have a big implication for the kind of audiences attending, like their social status? I know that you're saying it kept criminals out, but did it also keep, poorer members of society from watching racing?
It didn't stop them coming, although racing is probably always slightly more expensive activity in those days relative to people's earnings. But because they had a number of enclosures, the price range was quite wide. But yes, it was, by today's standards, very socially exclusive, in that there was a members enclosure, and then there were a slightly more expensive ring for those who were ardent people in gambling, and then cheaper ring. But I always thought that the centre of the course enclosure at Hurst Park and Sandown was a bit like going to the theatre and not being able to see the whole of the play, because of the view was much more restricted than it would have been in the grandstand. Yeah.
Going back to Elmbridge, focus on Elmbridge, why were there two race courses set up so close together? I mean, there might not be any kind of answer for this other than charts, I don't know. But it seems quite odd that there's two in one borough.
Yeah, well, I think the answer is really that although the Jockey Club set the rules and regulations, they didn't own any race courses. So individual race courses were privately owned or owned by companies, and they could compete against one another. the Jockey Club did set some standards which operated until quite relatively recently, that 2 meetings on the same day had to be at least 50 miles apart. But there wasn't any reason why Hurst Park and Sandown shouldn't both be operating. And of course, just across the river from Hurst Park is Hampton, which also opened around the same time. So you have actually had 3 racecourses within probably, if you leave the river out of it, about 3 miles apart.
How would the typical Victorian racegoer get to Sandown, and how did it change gradually as time progressed?
Well, again, one of the things that you identify from the more modern racecourses is their proximity to the railway, and the railway was all important in bringing in bigger attendances to the race. Some of the traditional racecourses that are still, in existence, like Epsom and Goodwood, actually are very remote from the railway. With Sandown, you had the Esher station just at the foot of the course. Kempton also had the line from Waterloo, and Hurst Park had the train to Hampton Court, which was slightly the wrong end of the course, but nevertheless wasn't that far away. And you also have to remember that the introduction of the railways made it much easier to bring horses to the races, because the horses would have been trained in training centres at stables, and they used to have horse box trains that would come too. And Esher station had 4 platforms plus an additional platform for race days for the public, and also had a horse box platform where they unloaded the horses and then walked them up to the course.
When did the kind of horses coming by train stop? It
stopped probably in the early 50s. Once motor horse boxes became more reliable and road traffic became, easier with better roads and so forth, it was easier. So I think it was a natural progression, really. But obviously, for many years, the horse box trains were a very important part of getting horses to the races, and much easier than in the days of Hampton races, as I talked about much earlier. They would have been walked all the way to the course from wherever they were stabled.
Great, thank you. Hurst Park was quite a long course in that, if you see the layout, I can't explain it here very well, but it was kind of following the road, and it was a very long course. Where exactly was the grandstand situated, and would racegoers be able to see the whole race?
Yeah, the layout of the course was basically dictated, as you said, by the Hurst Road, which was on one side, and the bend of the river, which was on the other. And the curve of the back of the course very much followed the bend of the river. The grandstand, unlike most race courses, had to be put in place at an angle. So in terms of some of the people who might be listening to this interview, if they know Tesco's on Hurst Park and can think about that being the winning post at the end of the home straight, the grandstands would have gone across at about a 45-degree angle towards the river. And so when you were in the grandstand, or the grandstands, the horses coming up the straight of the course from Hampton Court end were coming virtually head on towards you, which probably did make it slightly more difficult to work out who was in the lead than when you're looking sideways on as you are at Sandown.
Yeah, great.
But it was a solution to the limited land available. Yeah,
great. Thank you. Were there other? I'm quite, not an expert at all. What other kind of locations were there on the course where people could see the race other than the grandstand? Was there different locations?
Yes, there were. I've talked about, the sort of social segregation. If you, again, look at the grandstands going across the top of the course, the enclosure nearest to the winning post was the members' enclosure, which you had to be an annual member to go into. Next to that was something called Tattersall's enclosure, which was the main way to go in. I think when it closed, it was 10 shillings to to go in, which is 50p in today's money. And then in the centre of the course, totally flat, without any buildings, there was the, well, no buildings to raise you up to the races, was the course enclosure, where again, you could see the race, but of course, like anywhere else where you're all standing on the flat ground, you're going to get people in your way at times.
Great, thanks. So the grandstand was definitely, you know, back in the day, more for the more affluent people who are visiting, would you say?
Very much, yeah, very much for affluence, and of course the membership very much followed the model of the gentlemen's clubs in London, social clubs in London, whereby the only people who could be members were men, and they had to be elected by the recommendation of another member. And there are some quite detailed sets of rules about how to become a member of Hurst Park in those days. And once you were a member, you had a badge, transferable ladies badge, which means you didn't have to take the same lady to every meeting. You could take a lady of your choice.
Thank you very much.